Hey everyone, welcome back to the Amazing Collection. I'm so glad that you are joining me today. The Amazing Collection is your amazing Bible study that studies through Genesis through Revelation, book by book. Today we are in the book of Job, and we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So do me a favor, before we begin, go ahead and hit this like button up here that just tells me that you are ready and checked in for Bible study. And over here, if you can just subscribe to my channel, that means you will get every new video that is shared and posted and you won't miss a thing. So if you have your Bibles ready and you're open to the book of Job, let's begin. Okay, everyone, let's begin in the book of Job. Now, Job's theme is the sovereignty of God. It's very important that we always know what the theme is. So it very quickly reminds us of what is going on in the book and the purpose of the book. So the theme is the sovereignty of God. And the theme verse for this book is found in Job chapter 1, verse 21, which says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord forever." So that is the theme verse of this entire book. So we're going to do a quick introduction to the book of Job. Now we have just completed the Old Testament historical books, and now we're getting a different kind of genre in literature, and we're moving from history to poetry. The book of Job begins one of the 5 books of the poetical books, and Job is mostly written in poetry form, and it's considered one of the most profound and beautiful masterpieces of literature ever written. The book of Job asks the very profound question that many of us have asked before, and it's, why do good people suffer? And above all, the book of Job reveals God's sovereignty, his omnipotence, his omniscience, his wisdom, and his might. From this book, we may never understand all the things that go on in this book, but we can rest in knowing that God is sovereign over everything, over all. So let's begin with the 5 W's, what I like to call the 5 W's: the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. So the who, the author is unknown. Many think that the author is unknown, but we do have a main character, and the main character is Job. The what is, it is a narrative poem. The when is these events took place around the time of Abraham, which is way back 2000 BC, almost 4,000 years ago. Some authors and commentators have said that the book of Job may possibly be one of the oldest books of the Bible. The where is in Uz. This area is southeast of the Dead Sea, near the area of Edom. And again, the theme of this book, or the why, is the suffering of man and the sovereignty of God. For just a minute, let's imagine this scenario. Let's get our imagination going for just a moment. And let's just pretend that your life is going great. You have everything that you've ever wanted or ever needed. Life is good. You're thriving. You're basically on autopilot. Your family is healthy. Everyone's happy. You are highly favored and blessed. You have riches that you could ever imagine. You're well known. You are a righteous person. And then before you know it, calamity strikes. Disaster strikes. Your riches are taken, your body begins to rot and get sick and starts to fail, and your children are all dead. And to add insult to injury, your friends come to see you and accuse you that somehow why you're suffering is because of something that you have done in your past life, or something that you have done, or some sin that you're withholding. So that's the scenario. So the question is, if this actually happened to you, what would you do? How would you respond? How would you react? Would your faith still be in the Lord? Would you still have trust in God and his sovereignty? Or would you walk away from God? Would you turn your back on God? Would you wipe your hands of God and say, I'm out? So that is the setting that we're going to begin with. But again, Job is the first of a series of poetical books, and it's a dramatic poem, which means it's a story in poetic form. The first 2 chapters are written in prose, that is, written language that follows a natural flow of speech. And sandwiched in between is a lengthy poem. So again, what's outstanding and incredible to think about is the book of Job, again, could possibly be one of the oldest books of literature in the Bible. It's almost 4,000 years old. Crazy to think is the book of Job as a masterpiece as it is, how no one knows who the author is. So no one really truly got credit for writing this book. However, Job being the key character of this story, the ultimate centerpiece and the real glory goes to God. And we're going to read that and we're going to see that unfold. So again, Job lived in Uz, an area east of the area of Edom, southeast of the Dead Sea. And this book has particular interest to all mankind because it deals with, again, the very profound question is, why do good people suffer? Why do innocent people suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? How does suffering fit in with an all-powerful God? And why doesn't this all-powerful God do something about it? These are the questions that the book of Job answers. I want to share with you a true story about a young woman who was raised in a very church-going family. They went to church every weekend. They strongly believed in God. However, to this little girl, God to her was like Santa Claus. You would pray and you could ask him for things and then they would be given to you. She loved reading about stories of people who were in hard situations and in difficult circumstances. And when she would read that they would pray, God answered their prayers. And so she adopted that narrative, and that's what she believed. This little girl was actually almost 21 years old, about to graduate from graduate school, and about to marry the love of her life. Life was great. Life was good. Life looked promising. Her future was bright. Until one night in her own apartment, an intruder came into her own room, and she was awakened with a knife at her throat, pushed at her chin, and a hand covering her mouth. Someone had broken into her room, broken into her home. This person assaulted this young woman and took all of her valuables and everything that she loved. When he walked out of her home, he also took with him her faith in God. She couldn't understand why this all-powerful God didn't stop this from happening to her. And where was he when this happened to her? And for the next 10 years, she lived apart from God. She put herself at arm's distance from the God that she knew her entire life. Yes, she still believed that he was the creator of the heavens and the earth. When it came down to the real issues of life, he didn't seem to have power over anything. It's a very sad story, but let's be honest. Some of us have experienced very real things similar to this story. And I believe that we have all at one point in our lives have asked a similar question. Where are you, God, when I need you? Where were you when that happened to me? This is exactly the questions that the book of Job answers. The purpose of the book of Job is to show that God is sovereign over all things, even when we don't understand. So, let's begin. Section 1, we're going to start out this movie scene between God and Satan. Okay, so we are in the heavenly realm now. This is where this story begins. This is the heavenly command center. And there are 3 major scenes that I need to set up for you. So the first one is the controversy in heaven between God and Satan. The second one is the controversy between Job and his friends. And the third section is the controversy between God and Job. So those are the 3 main sections that we need to have organized in our minds as we read this unfolding. So section 1, again, it's the controversy between God and Satan. And we read that Satan asks in Job 1. And in Job 1, we have a few characters. In Job 1, though, we have Job is the first character. Job 1:1 says this: There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And this man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. So let's imagine that this description was about you. Let's imagine that this was something that was going to be said about you for all eternity. That you were holy, that you were blameless, that you feared God, and you turned away from evil. Well, that was Job. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He was one of the greatest men of all of the East, and he was wealthy. In Job chapter 1, verse 2, it talks about his wealth. It says, there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. Verse 3, he possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. So Job was a great man of notoriety. He had a great reputation. He had a great family, and he had great wealth. And then we see that the setting moves from earth to heaven. And the heavenly scene opens with a meeting between God and his angels, between God and his divine counsel. And we see the second character come into the scene, and his name's Satan, or the Satan. And God asked the Satan, or Satan, where did you come from? And Satan responded that he had been roaming the earth. This is a hyperlink to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, which says, be alert and sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. So we have an enemy. The scriptures say to be alert and be watchful because the devil, or Satan, prowls around like a roaring lion just seeking for someone to devour. There is spiritual warfare going on. Satan is looking. He's roaming the earth to look for someone to devour you. So God asked Satan, where did you come from? And Satan responded that he's been roaming around the earth. And we read that. And the Lord's response is in chapter 1, verse 8, which says, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? So then we read Satan believed that Job was righteous and upright because God had given him everything. Basically, that God had spoiled Job. Let's read in Job chapter 1, verse 9 through 12. This is a paraphrasing of what Satan's words to God would be like. God, you have spoiled Job. You have given him everything and anything he could possibly want. He has a great family. He has a great wealth. He has a great reputation. You have hedged him in and blessed him. And so, of course, he's going to worship you. But if you take away everything, I bet he's going to curse you. So Satan, in effect, challenges God, and God responds. And he says in Job chapter 1, verse 12, then the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. So Satan was given permission to take away Job's wealth, his possessions, and his children. So that's exactly what Satan did. He took away Job's possessions, and he took away Job's children. So what's important to know here is that Satan is always on a leash. He can only do what God tells him to do. We don't need to fear Satan. So Satan's on a leash. And then we read in Job chapter 1, verses 13 through 19, that Satan went to work on one disaster after the next and began to take things away from Job. And messengers came and reported that Job's animals were gone and stolen, that his servants had been killed. And the messenger even came and reported that a house had fallen on his children and that all of his children were dead. Everything was gone. And in Job chapter 1, verse 21, read with me where he says this. This is our key verse, our theme memory verse of the book. Job chapter 1, verse 21, it says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But what a picture of Job's faithfulness. What a picture of Job's righteousness here. He did not curse God, as Satan suggested that he would. And in Job chapter 2, we see Satan again come before God. And again, God said to Satan in Job chapter 2, verse 3, it says, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. So God stated that even though Satan had taken away everything from Job, he would still worship God. And so then Satan sets out for a second challenge. And we read that in Job chapter 2, verse 5. And it says, however, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to his face. So now, in other words, Satan is saying, if Job experienced physical pain, if his body began to fail, then he would curse God to his face. But God had confidence in Job And he responded in this way. Let's read in Job chapter 2, verse 6. So the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your power. Only spare his life. So now Satan was given permission to take away Job's health. So we begin to read that Job was covered with boils, which I'm not going to go into great detail with because it's disgusting. But not only was he suffering physically, but he was suffering mentally. He was suffering from depression. He was in such dire distress. Anyone would be in this situation. And in Job chapter 2, verse 7 through 8, we read that Satan immediately got to work and began to bring more disaster in Job's life. Again, he was covered with boils and had physical affliction. He went into severe depression. And in Job chapter 2, verse 9 through 10, this is another passage of scripture where we see the one line of Job's wife that she says, she only gets one sentence, but she is the one who says, curse God and die. Chapter 2, verse 9 through 10, let's read it. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. So we have to think about, this is a very unfortunate thing for the wife to say, right? And some commentators and scholars have been very critical about the wife's response in this situation. But we have to remember that the wife also lost everything. Job's wife also lost all of her children, all of their wealth. And she was watching her husband be tortured and tormented with all of this pain and affliction and suffering. However, with all that to be said, that's still no excuse for her words that were said. But it's just important that we consider the emotional frame of mind that she was in. Let's read about how Job responded to his wife. In Job chapter 2, verse 10, he says, but he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? So Job rebuked his wife because he thought she was a foolish woman, but because she had lost her faith and she was speaking like the foolish. So now we're in section 2, the controversy between Job and his friends. So we read that Job has 3, quote, friends, which aren't really friends, but more like attempted counselors to come. And they are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And so they came to visit Job in his suffering. In chapter 2, verse 11, we read, now when Job's 3 friends heard of all the adversity that had come upon him, they each came from his own place, and they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. Okay, so we see that their original intent was to sympathize and to comfort Job in his suffering. We see that these friends came to comfort him because they saw the stress and the distress that he was in and everything that Job lost. And they wanted to weep with him. They wanted to suffer with him, which I think is a great evidence of a good friend. So we see in Job chapter 2, verse 12, it says, when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward the heavens. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So let's point out here that from a distance, they didn't even recognize Job with everything he had been through. It was that bad. And their grief was intense for him. They raised their voices. They tore their clothes, which is in the ancient times was a sign of mourning and grief. And they sat in silence with him for 7 days. Remember that Hebrew word 7 is symbolic of completion, perfection, wholeness. It's a holy number, the number 7. And it's also important to note that sometimes silence is oftentimes the best response, to just sit with that person who is going through that hard thing. Oftentimes the best thing to do. And so in Job 2, verse 13, 7 times we see is also the typical time and duration of mourning in the biblical times. And we see that and we see in Job chapter 3, finally in his grief, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day he was born. Let's read in Job chapter 3, verse 1. It says, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day he was born. Okay, so it's important to note that Job did not curse God, but he did curse the day he was born. So in a way, he was wallowing in his own self-pity versus what he could have done was ask God, how can you use me in this? What can I learn from this? But because the suffering was so intense, he chose to curse the day he was born, which leads me to this reflective question. How do we respond in suffering? Do we respond similar to Job? Then we see how his friends confront Job about his suffering. And they start to assess the situation and start to deduce justification or reasoning behind his suffering. And Eliphaz is the one who's going to speak first. Eliphaz is going to argue from experience. Job chapter 4, we're going to see that Eliphaz has more of a gift of mercy. He was more kind and gentle in his approach as he spoke to Job. And he said, Job, I think you may have sinned. I think that you are in such distress, it must have been something that you've done or some sin involved. Some sin involved in your life is the reason why you're suffering. Makes sense? Well, let's read in Job chapter 5, verse 17 through 18. And chapter 5, verse 27, it talks about, behold, how happy is the man whom God reproves. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, for he inflicts pain and gives relief. His wounds and his hands also heal. Behold this, we have investigated it, and so it is. Hear it and know it for yourself. So in this comforting manner, Eliphaz basically told Job that he was being disciplined for something that he had done, and he hadn't confessed about it. So his life experience was on the basis of this conclusion. And Job's response was that I have not sinned. I have not sinned. And then we meet friend number 2. His name is Bildad. And his argument is going to be based on tradition. In Job 8, we're going to see that Bildad speaks. And unlike Eliphaz, Bildad does not have the gift of mercy as much. And he has a stronger approach when he talks with Job. And he basically says, if you look back over the generations, Job, we see there was sin, there was suffering. And tradition says sin results in suffering. So the common sense reason for all of this is you must, and that is why you're suffering. So this is Bildad's logic as well. In Job 8, verse 6 and verse 8, it says this, if you are pure and upright, surely now he would rouse himself for you and restore your righteous estate. Please inquire of your past generations and consider the things searched out by their fathers. So basically, Bildad is building on Eliphaz's opinion of his suffering. And it's basically determined that it must have been a generational sin in Job's family. And that is why Job is suffering. So the blame is now put on not only Job, but his forefathers. In Job's response in chapter 9, verse 17 and verse 20, he responds again, I have not sinned. Listen to me. I have not sinned. I can just see Job trying to get through to these people. And then friend number 3, his name is Zophar. He comes and speaks from common sense. His argument is common sense. In chapter 11, he's the last friend to speak so far, and from his perspective, he thinks it's clear that a righteous man would not suffer like Job. So the only explanation is that Job must have sinned. And we read in Job chapter 11, verses 14 through 15, it says, if iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and do not let wickedness dwell in your tents. Then indeed you could lift up your face without moral defect, and you would be steadfast and not fear. Job's response again, I have not sinned. So we see then 3 cycles of controversy, okay, that are given, and then we see Job answers. So the first cycle is a general cycle. It's a mild suggestion. So cycle 1, this is mainly from Eliphaz. His suggestion, or better yet, assumption, was there must have been sin in Job's life. It was given gently, or it was presented or plated gently, but Job would not admit any sin. And so then the conversation began to escalate. And the second cycle became more specific, and that was from Bildad. And his argument was more specific. It was more harsh. More condemnation that came with his argument. Bildad was saying, Job, you know you've sinned. When Job said that he had not sinned, they all became even more adamant about his sin. And the third cycle was definitely more harsh and heated.